This video is brought to you by Skillshare. With Doctor Who's success in 2005, an Earth-based spin-off series named Torchwood was commissioned, with character Captain Jack Harkness to appear as the main star, since he'd proven popular with his appearances in Doctor Who Series 1. Doctor Who showrunner Russell T Davies was the executive producer of the spin-off, but the head writer for Series 1 would be longtime Doctor Who fan and infamous Season 23 critic Chris Chibnall. During the production of Torchwood, Davies offered Chibnall the opportunity to write for Doctor Who itself. Davies wanted a storyline set entirely on a spaceship, and the pair came up with the idea to make the episode happen in real time, inspired by the American show 24. This led to Chibnall's first Doctor Who episode, titled simply 42, reflecting the 42 minutes the episode will take place during. 42 traps the Doctor and Martha on a mining spaceship crashing into a star, leading to a race against time. However, all of these years later, does this seemingly innocuous episode actually serve as a stark warning for Chibnall's polarising time as Doctor Who showrunner?
Well, not only that, but it was also very cliched. It was very routine, running up and down corridors and silly monsters.
The episode starts with the Doctor and Martha hanging out in the TARDIS, with Martha getting her phone upgraded so she can call from anywhere and any when. It's nice that they show this because it keeps consistency, as Rose needed her phone upgrading in the end of the world, so this keeps that continuity. It also shows how the Doctor has finally accepted Martha as a proper companion, although it highlights how many more hoops she has had to jump through compared to Rose, who got this privilege in her first outing, whilst Martha has had to go through half the series. However, there's no time to dwell on this, as they get a distress call or whatever. Must be the distressed viewers from the future warning you about this episode. I do like the immediate jump into action, with them not getting a chance to find out where they are before they're forced into action and intercepted by the crew, who are panicking because the engine has been shut off. It's a good way to plunge things into chaos right off of the bat. We then find out the ship is falling into a star, which creates a real sense of stakes, but I think the reveal is played too low-key and doesn't pack the punch it was probably intended to. I do like the concept of a real-time episode, since they only have 42 minutes before they fall into the star. It's a great idea for an episode, and it's a good way to frame the narrative, although it would later become a Chibnall trope, so it makes you roll your eyes upon rewatches after you're more familiar with his writing. The TARDIS is written out well, since the room becomes too hot so they can't get back inside. It's a logical way to stop them from being able to use it, but again, it doesn't really have a dramatic punch to it, and the Doctor doesn't really freak out as much as he did in, say, The Impossible Planet. It's one of those frustrating things about Chibnall episodes because stakes always seem to be devalued. Speaking of The Impossible Planet, I've always seen criticism of how similar 42 is to that two-parter, but I think that's mainly due to the aesthetic, which I don't think is a bad idea, and it's intentional. It creates cohesion and makes the universe consistent because it establishes that this is just how things look. It recaptures that grungy, lived-in industrial aesthetic, but amps up the industry, effectively selling it as a big industrial mining freighter. The comm system is all chunky and blocky. I think it's a great piece of design that really suits the setting and atmosphere. Similarly, having all of the characters being sweaty and gross really sells the extreme heat of the ship, serving as a constant reminder of the looming danger of the star. It then turns out that the only way to turn the engines back on is to go to the front of the ship, which has been locked behind a series of deadlock sealed doors. I like the concept of going through them all one by one, but the only way to open them is through the process of doing a pub quiz. It's a good vehicle for splitting the Doctor and Martha apart, and the idea of the crew getting drunk to come up with the questions makes sense, feeling quite realistic, but the pub quiz idea just kind of feels too gimmicky. Even so, having it as a framing device allows the opportunity for some jokes and references, which comes in the form of the classical music question being about Elvis and the Beatles. It's a good joke that's reminiscent of The End of the World in Series 1, which does the exact same joke but with Britney Spears and Soft Cell. Huh. However, the stuff with the doors is actually the B-plot of the episode, which later becomes very apparent because they pretty much ignore it after a while. The main plot of the episode is about the sabotage of the ship and the possessed Corwin, who we are introduced to in the medbay. This scene is a good way of establishing one of the most important building blocks of the episode, since we're straight away told he sabotaged the ship, and he begs for them to not make him look at them. It answers one mystery but sets up another. We soon find out why he doesn't want to look at people because he gets up and starts to advance on the medic woman, and we find out he's Cyclops from the X-Men, but somehow even more lame, if that was even possible. The scene is done well, suitably horrific as our main characters hear her slow and painful death over the comm system, before we find out that she was disintegrated and is now no more than a silhouette of ash burned into the wall. It's quite a visceral visual. Corwin then claims another victim almost immediately, killing this grumbling mechanic woman who gets only 30 seconds of muttering to herself about not liking the crew. Having the monster of the week kill off characters is always a good way to establish them as a threat, but neither of the characters Corwin kills were even established well. We don't even know anything about them, and we can tell they were just there to be zapped. It shows just how little the crew is characterized, especially when you do compare it to the Impossible Planet, which used Scooty as the first victim. Annoyingly. Even though she was killed off first, you still had at least a rough idea of who she was and her place in the crew, so you cared about her death. This just isn't the case here. The crew dynamic feels almost non-existent. There's no chemistry whatsoever, despite this crew having been together for a while apparently. It feels like they barely know each other, because they all talk bluntly and doubt themselves and each other. They really don't feel like a team or a crew. There's supposed to be an emotional scene as Corwin's wife sees some humanity still in him and tries to appeal to it to talk him down, but you don't care about these characters at all. I care more about the buttons on the comm system than the supporting characters in the story. They're completely bland non-entities. But do you know what isn't bland? Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where creative people can come together and explore new skills or expand their knowledge in their existing passions. There are thousands of classes to explore, such as video editing, filmmaking and creative writing, along with so many others. Not only do the classes help inspire you and express yourself, they really allow you to accomplish real growth, because Skillshare introduces you to a community of millions and helps you create real projects with their support. Skillshare is designed specifically for learning, so there are no ads and new premium classes are always being launched. Personally, I would recommend the class Storytelling 101, Character, Conflict, Context and Craft by New York Times bestseller Daniel Jose Older. As a reviewer and an aspiring writer myself, this class was really helpful since it taught me a lot about the process and how to form a good narrative, allowing me to sharpen my own skills and change how I see narratives play out on screen. You can access this class and thousands of others by joining Skillshare for less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. In fact, the first 1,000 people to click the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership, so you can try it out for yourself and see what you think. This is an unprecedented time with so many important conversations happening in our world. Your voice is more essential than ever, and Skillshare can help you unlock your creativity for social good. So a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the review. Because Martha and Pub Quiz Guy are doing so well with, well, the pub quiz, Corwin decides that rather than killing the bald guy, he should give him his X-Men Cyclops powers. It's a good way to increase the threat, doubling the villain so that both protagonists can face danger. It's a smart way to increase the stakes of the episode, since there's now another thing to worry about. With nowhere else to go, Martha and Pub Quiz Guy flee into a conveniently placed escape pod. In that classic cliche, possessed bald guy and Pub Quiz Guy have a back and forth trying to out-type each other, with the escape pod flip-flopping between being jettisoned and not being jettisoned. Eventually, possessed bald guy just punches the keypad, and for some reason that locks it into being jettisoned, because we all know how much the entertainment industry loves punching control panels. But why do the back and forth in the first place? Why not just jettison it straight away? It could have given them some more time to establish Medic Woman and Grumpy Mechanic Woman back there. However, I do like when the pod is jettisoned and Martha begs for the Doctor to save her, with him shouting he will, but she can't hear him because it's completely silent. This detail is a really great moment that deserves to be in a much better episode than this. Despite it being completely inconsequential to the story, I do like the sequence of Martha in the escape pod. She continues to believe in the Doctor, showing how strong her faith in him is, continuing that running theme of her telling people to believe in him, which I seem to mention in every one of these reviews, just in case you forget about it. Martha also realises that her family will never know what happened to her, and they'll always be waiting for her to come home. home. The use of her theme in the background makes it an emotional moment of clarity and realization, hammering home the risks of travelling with the Doctor, because you might never come back. This idea seems to be one of Chibnall's strengths as a writer, because he would also touch upon a similar concept in the Torchwood episode Adrift, which is a really good episode exploring people being left behind in the Doctor Who world, and never knowing what happened. So it makes sense that this part with Martha is one of the best moments of the episode. Martha uses her new phone abilities to call her mum, trying to say goodbye but without being able to tell the truth. It's a good scene. I want to like the revelation of the Saxon henchwoman sitting there tracing the call, but it's severely undercut by a baffling logical oversight, because Martha calls Francine, rather than the other way around. With these kinds of scenes, the people tracing the call are the ones to initiate, or they at least know when the target is going to call them. Martha could have not called again for weeks, and what would evil Saxon henchwoman have done then? Spent weeks sitting at the dinner table twiddling her thumbs? If it sounds like a nitpick, that's because it pretty much is. But come on, you went to the effort of talking about happy prime numbers, but you managed to forget how phone tracing is portrayed in literally everything it has ever appeared in. They even have the woman do the classic finger rotation thing to keep the call going, so how did they overlook literally the only other part of a phone tracing scene? But I do appreciate that it's there because it helps to further the Mr. Saxon story arc, by showing Francine falling further under Saxon's influence, continuing the plotline established in the Lazarus experiment, by showing her distrust of the Doctor. Refusing to allow Martha to die, the Doctor demands a spacesuit and climbs out of the airlock to bring the escape pod back to the ship. It's a solid, intense moment thanks to the music, but it's again undercut by logical flaws. Why would the escape pod be withdrawn by controls outside of the airlock? Regardless, it's a good way to illustrate the lengths the Doctor will go to help people, and it justifies Martha's faith in him. However, it kind of makes you wonder what the point of the escape pod sequence was, if it just comes right back after some exposition. However, by going outside, the Doctor finds himself staring into the star, realising it's alive, and he becomes infected like Corwin and the bald guy. It's a good way to reveal the motivations of the villains, since they're not really villains in the first place. Early on in the episode, the Doctor noticed that the ship used energy scoops, which are supposed to be outlawed. This turns out to be important because they have actually been harvesting the star for fuel, so the star was fighting back and trying to defend itself, because it's actually alive. Somehow. It's a good wrinkle to the story, although once again it falls into what would become the Chibnall trope of humans being the real villains all along. The Doctor getting possessed is a good way to propel Martha into the lead role, forcing her to take charge. She becomes the hero for once, and the Doctor has to believe in her like she believes in him. It's an episode with a bit more of a focus on Martha, but it doesn't do as much as previous episodes like the Lazarus experiment. Martha does a good job in charge, trying to freeze the Doctor and then commanding the fuel be dumped, but that's all she really gets to do. The episode takes so long to get to this part of the narrative that it ends up being over before it starts. It's the trademark Chibnall ending, coming too suddenly for it to feel gratifying. There's too much meandering around and not enough proper build-up, so it doesn't feel like a dramatic ending. The Doctor is possessed and they're falling into a star. Martha is forced to take control, but there are only 2 minutes left, so she runs down a corridor, says one thing, and that's it. That's your big grand climax to pay everything off. It's just unsatisfying and frustrating. Corwin's wife sacrifices herself to kill Corwin in what's meant to be a really dramatic and emotional moment, but it falls short because you just don't care about her, so it doesn't do anything. However, the post-action is nice, one of the few things Chibnall does right here, along with being one of the things he seems to have forgotten how to do. There's a good little moment of the Doctor letting his inner darkness show before Martha gets the TARDIS key in a nice moment that solidifies her standing as a deserved companion. Then she calls her mum again and there's a very strong final shot that shows the Harold Saxon entourage with Francine, as hints of the Master Vainglorious plays, really drawing your attention to the story arc and building intrigue well. So before I went into this review, I had fond memories of 42. I remembered enjoying it and I didn't understand the hate for it. I thought it was perfectly serviceable, even when I last watched it a couple of years ago, but when I watched it again for this review after watching Series 12 earlier this year, I was honestly shocked and surprised at how similar 42 is to the episodes of the Chibnall era of the show. I had always thought 42 was one of his better episodes, free of the tedium and mediocrity he would become known for, but I quickly found out it really isn't. In fact, I think I'd go so far as to say it's a stark warning of what was to come. The warning lights were there all along. If you saw my Series 12 review, which most of you did, you might remember me saying the episodes were very formulaic and lifeless. They were like post-it notes with story beats the writers needed to hit. This is the same with 42. It feels like Chibnall just wanted to get from story beat to story beat, but there's no finesse, so it's a juddering stunted ride along a trail of those post-it notes. It's not an enjoyable experience. Then there are the other classic Chibnall tropes such as forgettable characters with no chemistry, awkwardly blunt exposition, and the iconic rushed ending to cap it all off. It's all Chibnall. It always has been. Nitpicks warned us, we didn't listen, and we got what we deserved. It's hard to talk about 42 without mentioning Chris Chibnall and his current position as showrunner. It's just relevant because it's recent. It's hard not to talk about the current state of affairs. I don't like to needlessly rag on Chibnall, but as soon as you're familiar with his stuff, you realise just how painfully bland and run-of-the-mill 42 is. It's full of stuff that has already been done before, but better. It doesn't really bring anything new to the table. The aesthetic of the episode is by far the greatest part of it, setting the atmosphere well, but the story doesn't do anything to reward this creative premise and setting. You may have noticed that I never actually used any of the supporting characters' names besides Corwin. That was on purpose because none of the names are memorable and they have no identifying character traits. You end up having to refer to them as stuff like Pub Quiz Guy and Bald Guy because that's the only way to keep track of who they even are. It's frustrating because part of the climax relies on you engaging with one of the characters and her relationship with the monster of the week, but you don't care. So much happens but so little happens at the exact same time. It's full of awkward exposition and the episode telling you what's already obvious.
Who's picking us off? One by one.
Oh really? I had no idea. David Tennant is good as usual, which is to be expected, with the Doctor having some good moments, along with Freema Agyeman doing well too as Martha. The industrial score by Murray Gold is a nice variation from the norm that builds a good atmosphere which combines effectively with the aesthetic. Because of these three people, the episode ends up scraping a D rank on the Series 3 tier list. I've mentioned in the past about how Mark Gatiss episodes are average, but 42 proves to me that Gatiss episodes are the good side of average, whilst Chibnall episodes are very much the bad side of average. It's just so bland and hollow. It's still better than Tooth and Claw though, if only because of the aesthetic of it all. It's also more enjoyable than his Silurian two-parter, and any episode he's written as showrunner, but it probably helps when you have David Tennant, Freema Agyeman and Murray Gold propping your episode up, along with Big Man Russell lurking over your shoulder to make sure it's at least somewhat watchable. I would not recommend this episode to anyone. Forget Burn with me, burn this episode. And I'd like to give a special thank you to my gold level patrons, Steph McNever Miller and Mark Hip Old Guy Taylor. Thank you a lot for your support.